here. It's awesome to see so many folks here. Let me get this. Folks see okay? Okay. Well, welcome everyone. As Jill said, my name is Zach Fosty. I'm an assistant professor of higher ed here at the University of Kansas, and I'm coming to you from Lawrence, Kansas, which I do want to note that KU and our campus occupies the homelands of several tribal nations, including the Kaw, the Kickapoo, the Sioux, the Osage, and the Shawnee people. It is really special to be here with you all today. I did my undergraduate work at Western Illinois University. So much of my thinking and my teaching and my writing is grounded in my time at WIU. Tracy gave me my first opportunity to do research and to publish. When I first got to KU, when I arrived here on my first day, I had a package waiting for me, and I didn't know who was sending me mail because I just arrived here. And it turned out that the former professor of mine, Keith Bockelman in political science, had sent me a note and a WI pennant saying how proud they were of me. And so this place has always meant a lot to me, and it is just great to be back with you all today and be a part of this community. So the title of the talk today is Beyond the Good Intentions of Diversity Work, the Material Consequences of Whiteness in the Lives of Students of Color. So let's go ahead and get into it. The summer of 2020, notably the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor really created conditions in which university leaders at predominantly white institutions had no choice but to at the very least make some sort of statement. Now, what those statements said varied. A lot were pretty empty, and that raised a number of critiques and pushback from students, particularly students of color and their labor on campuses. But we got all these pronouncements of diversity and inclusion and what universities were going to do in this critical time. But you couldn't help but notice that these statements often mirrored what sociologist Carol Anderson describes as diversity without oppression, that we celebrate the presence of difference without any underlying attention to the systems that render difference significant in the first place, right? So if we're going to talk about valuing racial diversity, supporting racial equity, we can't merely celebrate the presence of difference, right? We have to understand the underlying systems and structures that produce these highly stratified, inequitable systems that limit the ability of students of color to thrive. And to do that, from my scholarly point of view, we have to talk about whiteness, and not in some way that just recenters white people or white interests, right? But to think about how whiteness underwrites racially hostile and unwelcoming campus climates. Carolyn Turner said years ago that to be a student of color at a PWI is akin to being a guest in someone else's home. That you're always and forever a visitor. You don't see pictures of yourself on the wall. You do not have a place that feels like your own. You don't see folks who look like you. Well, if we were to extend her analogy, almost 25 years later, we could say that the very foundation of that house, the structure that the house is built upon, is whiteness. An ideology that's individualistic, ahistorical, one that elevates the humanity and the contributions of white people. So it's white people who feel at home in the house, white people who see themselves represented in the house, and white people who feel at home. And so just to continue with this analogy, as Jill referenced in the intro, one of the ways in which I've been thinking about this matter lately is how whiteness shapes our campus environments, how it shapes the spaces we collectively take up and move through, who's afforded the right to physical spaces, who's seen as worthy as occupying spaces, who fits in certain spaces, and who is made to be an outsider, an intruder, someone who interrupts space. And so today I want to talk about how we can move beyond this rhetoric of diversity and towards more critical understandings of how our campus spaces become white, how they take on racial meanings. And I'll use some examples from a study that I've been working on over really the last two and a half years here at KU. When I was doing some work at 3 different universities. So I do want to make one note as we go through today. I'm going to center and talk a lot about whiteness, but I want to make an important distinction. Philosopher Zeus Leonardo notes and reminds us that whiteness does not equal white people, right? Whiteness is an ideology created to uphold the interests and values of white people, but just as men can conceivably act against systems of patriarchy, if we think about the good work Tracy has done over his career, so too can white people conceivably act against whiteness. So I don't want to conflate whiteness and white people. But we are going to talk a lot about how systems of whiteness benefit white folks and create conditions that mark students of color as outsiders in physical spaces on campus. So how might we think about this relationship between race and space? We could probably spend an entire talk just taking up this question. But for the sake of time, I'll just say it's important to note that historically race and space have always been linked, and space is really a central mechanism by which racial boundaries have been drawn and reinforced and given meaning. So the removal of indigenous peoples from their land as a means of westward expansion and the cultivation of property as a form of exchange value for European settlers, the restriction of land ownership to white men. Cheryl Harris, for those of you familiar with her brilliant work, describes whiteness as a form of property, for instance. Practices like redlining and restrictive covenants that intentionally produced all white communities. We might think about the clustering of Black communities in urban ghettos, disconnected and cut off from important resources and opportunities made available to white families in the suburbs. George Lipsitz, who's a professor of American Studies and one of the leading authors of Race, Space, and Place, he's described how suburbs historically came to represent a sense of morality, hard work, and family values against the backdrop of morally bankrupt Black urban centers. And so we could go on and on. My point is we have to think critically about this historical and contemporary relationship between race and space. And often in higher ed, when we talk about race in our campus environments, we do so via a lens of segregation. And this is valuable, right? How patterns of segregation exist on campus and what we can do to interrupt those patterns. But what I want us to think about today with this relationship between race and space is more than just patterns of segregation. It's to think about how physical spaces, supposedly race neutral spaces, take on racial meanings, and more specifically, racial meanings as white spaces. And so I want to push us today to think about how spaces on our campus take on deeply racialized meanings, and to do so, to spark the discussion, I'm going to use campus housing as an example. A living on campus is held up as this really important educational experience for students, so much so that a lot of our institutions require students to live on campus. These spaces are deeply racialized. Some students live in luxurious residence halls, nicer than any home many of us could ever hope to afford someday, right? While others live in buildings that are so outdated that you'd never see them on a campus tour or on university brochures or materials. And not unlike students' pre-college environments, we see how spaces become marked by racial undertones. And in the case of the study I'm going to share, newer, nicer buildings are described as for white, affluent, or at the very least, like middle-class white students, while older, outdated buildings are framed as the ghetto, the hood, the trenches, and primarily house Black students and other students of color. And this is language I frequently heard during the study that I'm going to share with you all today. I'll say, well, I'm going to speak about this relationship between race, space, and our campus environments in the context of housing. You need not work in residence life to think about these ideas. For me, this isn't so much a talk about residence life and housing as it is about campus environments more broadly and how they take on racial meanings. And I'm going to use campus housing as that entry point, but I'd invite you to consider these ideas in the context of other physical spaces on our campuses. So I just want to share with you a little bit about the study that I'm drawing from on this talk. And this talk comes from a larger study I conducted over the last two and a half years that explored the climate for racial diversity in campus residence halls across 3 universities in the United States. And originally I was interested in interactions across difference within halls, how race shaped patterns of engagement, the presence of overt and more subtle forms of racism in these spaces, and so forth. And while this is still a part of the study and different things I'm writing and sharing from the project, one thing I didn't expect to find when I got into the field, or what I wasn't anticipating, were these deeply racialized perceptions of university housing among students, that certain buildings were built for and occupied by affluent white students. And others, those outdated, overlooked halls, were again considered or framed in very racialized terms, the hood or the ghetto, and were primarily seen as places where Black students and other students of color lived. And so the study was recently published in the Journal of College Student Development. Happy to share it with folks. And it was also featured in a feature write-up by Inside Higher Ed. And I've really been struck by how interested folks have been in this work, folks who have reached out, who have asked questions, a number of folks in residence life, primarily residence life professionals of color who intuitively know this process to be true. And so I'll spare you the details of most of the design of the study, but I do just want to share a bit about each of the institutions and some contextual details, because what I learned when I was studying these campuses was that it wasn't just that students attached racial meanings to residence halls, but that institutional practices and policies really accelerated this, legitimized racialized meanings. In some ways, then we also have to attend to the institutional policies and practices that are often thought of quote unquote race neutral that fuel these racialized meanings. So there were 3 institutions in the study. And at each of these institutions, I interviewed students, housing staff, and at 2 of the 3 institutions, really senior university officials. At Midwestern University, I'll just share a bit about each of these campuses. At Midwestern University, it was a regional comprehensive institution. And the campus was home to a really prestigious premier residence hall, what I call Pollard Hall in the study. And it was the most updated building on campus, featured tons of amenities, really aesthetically pleasing, and by far the most expensive hall on campus. And it was juxtaposed against the towers, which were these really institutional old buildings, cinder block concrete. A senior official told me that they hadn't been updated since like the 1970s at all. And those were the buildings where primarily students of color lived, and it was often framed as the ghetto or the hood relative to Pollard, which was seen as being built for affluent white students. Midwest also was home to a quote unquote affordable living community, where if you worked on the janitorial service or the food service, you were able to live there at a reduced cost. But the building had absolutely no amenities, not even air conditioning. So really just a highly stratified system of campus housing. And this was also sort of institutionalized by the fact that at Midwestern, when you put your housing deposit down before enrolling, determine the order in which you signed up for housing throughout the entirety of your career at Western. So you got a line of folks in a pecking order that was largely sort of correlated with wealth and also race in terms of who could pick the residence hall rooms at what time. So that was Midwestern University. Southeastern University was another campus in this study, home to a pretty large portion of Black students. It was in the Deep South. And when I traveled there, one of the things that really struck me, particularly from Black students' accounts of campus, was this special, unique living opportunity called the neighborhood. And the neighborhood was a series of houses on the edge of campus behind a gate. And the neighborhood was supposed to be conceivably open to any registered student organization. It was this unique, non-traditional living operation where groups of student organizations could live together. Well, it turned out that all but 2 houses in the neighborhood were occupied by white fraternity and sororities. So it was a space that was, as I'll share throughout the talk, considered almost completely off limits to Black students on that campus, and that they rarely ever went to out of fear of safety or comfort. And finally, at State University was a large research institution out west. They had a pretty strong infrastructure in residence life for engaging students on race and difference and equity, but they were also home to a highly stratified system of housing that was largely divided between older, more outdated buildings at the top of the hill and these new, luxurious, really absurdly expensive residence halls at the bottom of the hill. And so there was a perceived divide between who lived at the top of the hill and who lived at the bottom of the hill. So I want to share 3 key ideas from the study today. And again, I'm talking about this in the case of campus housing, but I'd invite you to consider this relationship between race and whiteness and space and other contexts. The first is that campus spaces are deeply racialized, right? That physical spaces become imbued with racial meanings, and these racial meanings that are attached to physical spaces are understood by members of the campus community, especially white members of the campus community, in sort of commonsensical, seemingly natural ways. That's just the way things are. So I'll share some quotes from the study that illustrate that. Second is it isn't just that racial meanings are attached to buildings or spaces, but that this process has significant consequences in the lives of students of color. And this is what the title of the talk is all about, getting at the material and psychological consequences of whiteness in the lives of students of color. And so as I'll share momentarily, the racialization of certain spaces like residence halls as white spaces produces conditions in which students of color don't have access to the wide range of resources the institution offers. They don't have substantively equal access to an education because there is a sense that some spaces on campus are not for them. And then finally, despite these practices, I'll conclude by noting how, again, in spite of the institution, students of color resist and create spaces that uplift values of community and support. So let's look at some examples of what I mean when I say that racial meanings are attached to physical buildings. There's perhaps no quote that more accurately sums up this research for me than this one, which came from one of the only Black administrators in the study. He's one of the only senior level Black officials at any of these campuses. And speaking about Pollard Hall, remember that was the nicest and newest building at Midwestern. This is what he told me. He said, "Zach, think of it as the Vermont of residence halls. It's just a very white building." And so this idea that certain residence halls, certain spaces were considered white dorms really manifested across all three of these campuses. And I'll share a couple quotes from students here that illustrate this. And as an outsider to each campus, I have to say, it's really interesting to immerse yourself in another institution because you're very much an outsider. You don't have the taken for granted assumptions and knowledge about the campus that members of the community do. So many of these participants in this study spoke about racial meanings attached to buildings, but they spoke about these perceptions and assumptions as if they were sort of common sense or widely known. So for instance, Noah, who was a white RA at Midwestern University, the campus with Pollard, this is what he told me. "People say, 'Oh, Pollard, that's the white dorm.' I've heard that before. I heard it from RAs during training. I heard it from a hall director during training, but the hall director is pointing out what they've heard and stuff about the hall. But I've also heard students talk about it before, just in general, it kind of came up, you know what I mean?" Noah was one of about probably 70 participants in the study, but this passage really sticks out to me because it highlights how these ideas circulate through our campus community. They become so taken for granted. Now, Darius, who was also at Midwestern, a Black student, he said it a bit more poignantly. He said, "Pollard, that's all white. Pollard, there's not any Black people in there. It's a few, but not many." And finally, I'll share a quote from Alicia, who was a Black woman student at Southeastern. And she spoke at length about what amounted to a really stratified system of campus housing on her campus. And that there were a set of really old, outdated buildings that were frequently the subject of jokes and ridicule. And she told me this: "They'll be like, 'Oh, Jones, Rogers, and Western Hall, those are the best dorms.' And they'll be like Thomas, Scott, and Warren especially, they'll be like, 'Those are the trenches.'" And she would go on to tell me that at times she felt embarrassed to tell people where she lived, but that it's what her and her family could afford. But time and time again, I heard this language to refer to older residence halls where the majority of students of color tended to live. This language of trenches. The building is a ghetto. One student described the building as looking like a motel. Another explained that a building resembled a juvenile detention center, right? So it's not simply about who lives where and the meanings that spaces take, but it really gets to this idea of who is afforded these perceptions exist, but that they have significant consequences in the lives of students of color. That when our campus spaces take on racial meanings, when they become in effect white spaces, certain bodies are assumed to be the natural occupants of a space, right? Entitled to resources and opportunities a space offers, while others are framed as bodies out of place, as outsiders, departures from the normative sensibilities of what primarily white audiences in a space expect of the places they inhabit. So if you take one thing from today, for me, it's not just that our campus spaces take on racial meanings, but residence halls, the business school, Greek Row, wherever on campus, but that they implicitly mark students, Black students and other students of color, as out of place, as trespassers or disruptions to the university. And so as I mentioned earlier, I'll share a couple quotes here. Southeastern was home to this special living community called the Neighborhood, and all but 2 houses in that space were occupied by historically white fraternities and sororities. And so while the space was conceivably open to anyone, there were often programs and events in the space as well as social events. So, there was stuff going on there. There was a sense among virtually every Black student I spoke with that the space was off limits to them. And I learned this sort of because when I would start my interviews with students, they would ask, how I was doing. And I told them I was staying on campus for 5 days and that the university had put me up in the neighborhood, that's where they were letting me stay. And their eyes all widened and they said, oh, you're staying in the neighborhood. It happened to be around Halloween time too. And they said, you're going to see a lot of white stuff going on in the neighborhood if you're staying over there and it's Halloween, because of what white students are allowed to get away with in terms of partying and all the nonsense that goes on over there. So this neighborhood was a highly racialized space on campus. One student, Shayla, she explained to me, it's like off limits. You know your place not to go to the neighborhood. They're not welcoming over there. It was really like a white people only type of thing. This language, your place, is so striking to me that a student within her own campus would feel compelled to describe her relationship to the physical university in such a way, your place. Another Black woman gave me this really powerful metaphor. I asked, do you feel unsafe going to the neighborhood? And she was, I don't feel unsafe, but I feel uncomfortable. And she said, I would feel like a raisin in a bowl of rice going to the neighborhood, that it would be so visibly striking to see her in the neighborhood. In a similar regard, Ezra, who was an RA and was at times required to go to the neighborhood for programs and events put on by the department, said this to me. Immediately on going to the neighborhood, whenever I went inside them gates, even if it's for there was a safe trick or treat thing that I went with a couple of friends on, I felt like this aura that's like, I don't feel like I belong here immediately when I walked inside those gates, straight up every single time. Ezra would go on to explain to me in the interview, which was my last before I flew out for the weekend, and he told me that he completely avoided the neighborhood outside of work responsibilities, that a lot of students found it as a space to socialize, especially on the weekends. But he looked at me dead in the eye and he said he had no interest in hearing white guys say the N-word over and over again. And that's why he didn't go to the neighborhood. This dynamic also manifested at State University. Now, as I mentioned, State had one of the stronger infrastructures for engaging students on race and racism, but they still had a really highly stratified system of residence life with these incredibly luxurious residence halls at the bottom of the hill. Luis, who was a Latinx RA and had at one point been an RA in the honors dorm at the bottom of the hill, explained it this way. The honors dorms is way nice housing and everything, right? But I honestly could care less about the housing and how nice it is, how convenient it is, if the people that live there are people that are constantly looking at you, constantly looking or judging you for every single thing that you do. Luis would later tell me how tiresome it was having to write up affluent, rich white men who constantly questioned his authority as an RA, that at times they even suggested that they would fight him if he wrote them up. And he associated this to being a brown man in a very, very white residence hall. He recalled another instance in which he met the campus police officers at the entry to the residence halls to take the officer upstairs to deal with the issue. And you can imagine what the officer asked Luis, right? The officer said, okay, so what did you do? Why are you in trouble? Again, Luis's experience, totally tiresome, totally burdensome of being in racialized spaces at the bottom of the hill. And it's just one last example. I want to come back to Pollard Hall at Midwestern because these perceptions weren't just held by students. A senior administrator told me this about the discourses surrounding the potential of diversifying the building, because there were critiques on campus that Pollard was really white. And this is what this senior administrator said. We do have people on campus who say, well, they're poor. They shouldn't live in Pollard. They're just making their bill higher, and they aren't going to pay anyway. So much of this dynamic at Midwest was interesting because, again, while they had this beautiful new building in Pollard, they also had the outdated towers where most Black students lived. They also had just introduced that low-cost, affordable housing option, right? And at the time, it was a floor or two in one building, and to live in the hall, you had to agree to work either the front desk or the cafeteria or as a part of the custodial team. And the building had literally nothing in the way of amenities. Didn't even have air conditioning. They just had those little portable AC units that you'd fill up with water. So again, just such a stark juxtaposition again. And here we see how racial meanings become attached to physical spaces, and by extension, the people who inhabit them. The major point again, though, for me is that white spaces mark students of color as out of place, as trespassers or departures from the normative expectations, white normative expectations for physical spaces. And I'll share one last anecdote, and this comes from Tiffany, who's a Black woman RA at Midwestern. She happened to live in Pollard, the nicest building, but only because she had been placed there as an RA. And even though that's where she lived, she told me that she always felt at home in the towers. This is where most of the Black students lived. It had a sense of Black cultural affirmation, a Black cultural presence that she could never find in Pollard. In Pollard, she said she was constantly getting looks like she didn't belong or that she was a visitor, but she didn't actually live there. When in fact, she was the RA in charge of the building. She was the senior most resident advisor in the building. And so this brings me to my very last point, that in spite of the racialization of space, Black students and other students of color in the study continued to create community wherever they found themselves. And so I just want to share these last accounts, and then I'll wrap up because they emphasize the agency of students of color on campus. And I keep referencing Black students because that was the majority of students of color in the study. Alicia, the Black undergrad at Southeastern, she said, the people made it so much fun. I think Billings or Stevens or maybe even Rogers, those were the most lit dorms of all, and it just became a close-knit thing. We just made it fun. We had sleepovers and movie nights. We made it fun. We had rap battles. Shoot, we did everything under the sun, under the moon. And Jayla also said, Warren is the cheapest dorm. It's also kind of run down a little bit, but it's very livable. It's not like a terrible thing, but you see the same people come in and out of Warren. I take a lot of pride in it. It's a great community. This reminds me of a quote from George Lipsitz, who talks about historically out of racial segregation has come congregation and community and racial solidarity. And that's exactly what I saw time and time again with numerous students of color, and particularly the large amount of Black students in the study describing their experiences at these three white institutions. Last thing I want to share, and then I promise I'll wrap up, is as qualitative researchers, we often do something called member check. So we share our interpretations of data with our participants. Well, I shared the study in the written paper with students, and this came from Tiffany, who I've referenced throughout the study. And this is what she emailed me back when I shared with her the journal article that now appears in the Journal of College Student Development. I asked for her thoughts. She said, I read that entire manuscript twice. I found myself nodding in agreement and becoming frustrated with some of the practices done by my own and other universities. Though my experience relates to my time at Midwestern, I could relate to other students and the feelings of spaces we are, quote, allowed to occupy. Seeing this all come together makes me feel as though it was never all in my head, but a system that needs restructuring to allow me to participate in different spaces. So I just want to end with some lingering questions, and I have a handout as well that I'll share with Jill. But some things we might think about: are there particular spaces on your campus that become known as white spaces? Our entire campuses at historically white institutions are white spaces, but how do particular physical spaces come to be known as white spaces? And what seemingly race-neutral policies and practices produce white spaces? How do white spaces mark students of color as outsiders within their own campuses and limit their ability not just to succeed, but to thrive, to find joy, and to have substantively equal access to all parts of our campuses? And finally, how do the ideas presented today complicate perhaps static notions of sense of belonging? We talked about belonging in the first keynote. Belonging is a term that's really hot right now. But I would ask us, how might belonging be place-based? And how might students feel like they belong in particular parts of our campuses, and certainly not others, like the neighborhood, for instance? So thank you. With that, I will stop the share. And Jill, I'm not sure where we're at time-wise for questions, if we have time.
We do have time for questions, so please either unmute yourself or throw it in the chat.
I'm probably out of place, a little bit disconnected from what you said, but anyway, first of all, thank you for the great presentation. It was really interesting and informative and very well presented also, by the way. So I saw a study, well, maybe 10 years ago by a professor of sociology at, anyway, somewhere out west on the West Coast. And she was studying Christian groups on campuses. And that she's Korean, she's ethnic Korean, and she observed this kind of sudden phase change between Christian groups, which were nearly all white on these campuses. And then when a population got to a certain percentage of Asian Christians, then all of a sudden the groups shifted over to be almost completely Asian, Korean, Chinese, or whatever. And she read it as this, the kinds of quotes that she got from the people that talked about this was this desire to be with people that they could relate to more easily, right? So I just wondered, do you see that this is a specifically a trend of whiteness, or a kind of a preference among students for that cultural identity is a lot more important than we can have given it credit?
Yeah, I think you might be referring to the work of Julie Park at Maryland. She's done a lot on Christian groups and campus segregation, and shows that Christian student groups tend to be really white, which is problematic because there's a long history of Black Christianity that is then unaccounted for Black students. JT Snipes, who's at Southern Illinois Edwardsville, is doing that type of work. I highly recommend his work. I think I'm thinking about this, I think, less in terms of sort of identity-based segregation and more the ways institutions are sort of fueling this, right? So these really neoliberal impulses to build newer and fancier and more luxurious residence halls to recruit students that then inherently privilege wealthy white students and their families, right? Like, that senior university official told me in the study, he said, we know that there are students who will not come to our institution if they can't live in Pollard. So what are we going to do? Right? Otherwise, we're gonna lose them. So I think there's space to talk about it in terms of sort of cultural identities and affinity groups, because one of these campuses did a really good job of institutionally sort of creating affinity spaces in the residence halls. One had living learning communities for Black students who wanted to opt in to a Black learning community. But I'm really thinking about this in terms of who's afforded the right to move through these spaces in ways that the institution holds up. So like the neighborhood is another example of that. It's supposedly a race neutral space, but it institutionally or structurally lends itself to white students. Not sure if that meets the question, but.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Her name was Rebecca Kim, by the way. Just
oh, okay.
There is a note for you in the chat.
From Megan, wondering what those schools have since changed to ensure housing equity. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to interpret the question. I'm not sure how much housing equity exists on a lot of these campuses. I mean, we take for granted that housing and residence life, I know there are a lot of housing folks on the call, and I think resident life folks do a lot of really important work to push equity and justice education among students, but at the same time, exists within this really neoliberal structure that says we got to build new residence halls, we got to build these spaces that are lure students. And that are just wildly unaffordable to a significant portion of the campus community, right? And so what, if we're thinking about equity and housing, like what I found is that while housing is supposed to be this space that interrupts pre-college patterns of segregation and exposes students to difference. And what we mean by that is really expose white students to difference, right? Like that's what we really mean. But it doesn't really even do that in a lot of cases. At many of these institutions, it just fueled or repeated those pre-college patterns of segregation.
Awesome. Well, if you all can join me in thanking Dr. Fossey for that really great keynote speech, that would be wonderful. Again, thank you. That was awesome.